Buenas tardes a todos, muy bienvenidos al Salón Rojo de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Es un placer para mí darles la bienvenida a esta actividad organizada conjuntamente por el Centro de Derechos Humanos de la Facultad y Amnistía Internacional en Argentina, y en este sentido agradecerle a Amnistía a través de Mariela Belski y Paola García Rey los esfuerzos para organizar esta actividad conjunta. Es un honor para mí también presentarles a nuestra oradora de la noche, que es Joanna Erdman. La profesora Erdman es canadiense, es básicamente una de las autoridades que existe en el mundo académico anglosajón y los ámbitos de influencia de ese mundo académico sobre el tema de el derecho a la salud, de aborto, derechos sexuales y reproductivos de las mujeres. Para nosotros en la Facultad de Derecho, y estoy segura que en esto podría usar el plural real de involucrar la amnistía, es un placer contar con ella aquí. Joanna no solamente enseña estos temas, habla de política de salud y es directora asociada del Instituto de Derecho a la Salud del Dalhousie University. Me estoy riendo porque le había preguntado cómo pronunciar el nombre de su universidad, sino que además es la editora, junto con otras personas como Rebecca Cook y Bernard Dickens, de un libro sobre el aborto en el derecho transnacional. Joanna es canadiense y es una autoridad en estos temas, y esto es importante en el especial momento que está viviendo hoy la Argentina, porque Canadá es un país que hace 30 años que tiene despenalizado el aborto. Y esa despenalización se dio a partir de una decisión de la Corte Suprema de Canadá, en el caso Morgenthaler, que tuvo en cuenta justamente derechos de las mujeres. Estamos en un periodo en el cual escuchamos muchas voces a favor de la despenalización, muchas voces en contra de la despenalización. Algunos argumentos parecen más sustentables que otros, pero la realidad es que también hace falta escuchar experiencias de cómo son las cosas en determinados contextos. Nosotros podemos tener una experiencia nacional de cómo son las cosas en un contexto en el cual hay solo 2 supuestos de aborto no punible. Pero Canadá puede contarnos a nosotros cómo son las experiencias en 30 años de erradicar cualquier tipo de criminalización del aborto y de consagrar el derecho al aborto. Esto es básicamente el gran propósito de esta noche, más allá también de podernos iluminar con el pensamiento de una mujer inteligente y que trabaja estos temas. La mecánica de la actividad es la siguiente: la profesora Erdman va a hacer una presentación de unos 10 o 15 minutos, y luego Mariela Belski de Amnistía va a establecer un diálogo con ella, que primero va a ser entre ambas, y luego se abrirá a las preguntas del público. Ustedes saben que una de las cosas que hacen que uno sea muy mal educado en esta facultad son los horarios de clase. Así que yo ya avisé, y le avisé a nuestra invitada, que yo tengo una clase que tendría que haber empezado hace 3 minutos, pero igual voy a llegar on time. Así que por eso me disculpo por no estar con ustedes. Joanna, it's really a great pleasure for us to have you on board. We really appreciate your knowledge, your teaching, and your thought in this very sensitive issue, more sensitive is even in this peculiar time of Argentina, where we are just debating that in Parliament, where Parliament has called for citizens to come and to put over the table their views. So we are just waiting to know from your speech to get some experience on how Canada has been in these 30 years without any criminalization of abortion. So, as I told you, I apologize for not being here in the rest of your speech. And again, we are very much pleased to have you on board. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias, y aprendan, que seguramente va a ser muy instructivo. Muchas gracias. See you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and really the invitation to join you today and to share some of the experiences from Canada. It's an absolute privilege to be in Argentina during this time of great democratic opportunity, and really the mark and achievement of a very long struggle for health and human rights. So today I'll speak directly to the question, what if we had no criminal law on abortion? What would people do? Women, doctors, parents, partners? Would they act differently? Would they act differently? Oh, closer. So what would people do if there were no criminal law on abortion? Would they act differently? Would they act differently sexually, socially, professionally? Would they think differently about their bodies, about themselves, about their relationships with others, about pregnancy or reproduction, about life itself? And maybe most importantly, would they change their values? Would they believe in something that they had not believed in before? Would they neglect or leave behind some values or ideas? Or what new ideas or views would they adopt? And so in the global arena, we often hear the phrase that legal reform is not enough. But the question is why? What changes and what stays the same when you change or reform a law? In Canada, these are more than rhetorical questions. These are not hypothetical scenarios, because in fact, we have no criminal law on abortion, and we have had no criminal law on abortion for the last 30 years. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the criminal law on abortion as an unconstitutional violation of women's rights. The law at that time allowed for hospital-based abortions when the continuation of pregnancy threatened a woman's life or health, but only when that was authorized by a hospital committee. And the court struck down the law on an argument of procedural fairness. They said that the law was dysfunctional in how it worked. It created gross disparities in access. Access to abortion as set out in the criminal code was not accessible to many women who formally qualified for a legal abortion under the code. And this was due to a number of the mandatory procedures that the court put in place. These procedures significantly diminished access to the law, leading to long delays, increasing risk, and frankly, breeding conditions for abuse and exploitation within the formal system. And so the court struck down the law as unfair, as arbitrary, in part because it defeated its own objectives. It was indeed not saving health or life, but causing precisely the opposite effect. It was putting people's lives in danger. After the court judgment, no new criminal law was ever passed. Parliament attempted but failed to pass a new criminal law, such that abortion today is not regulated by any federal law. Rather, abortion is regulated under provincial health laws. And these are laws of general application that apply to healthcare services generally. These include laws around the accreditation of health facilities and also the self-regulatory bodies that oversee discipline or training of healthcare providers across the different health professions. The Canadian Medical Association, for example, has a policy on induced abortion. It characterizes the decision to terminate a pregnancy as a medical decision, and it treats the act of abortion as a medical act. So what are the real or material consequences of this decriminalization of abortion? Or maybe we can more properly say this redistribution of regulatory power from the criminal law to health law, criminal authorities to health authorities. The first question that most people ask is whether or not the decriminalization of abortion resulted in higher rates of abortion. And the simple answer is no. Abortion rates have not increased over the 30 years since decriminalization. Indeed, the contrary is true. Overall, abortion rates have been in a steady decline, at least since the 1990s, despite a relatively stable birth rate. There are approximately 100,000 abortions per year, resulting in an abortion rate of about 14, so that is per 1,000 women. And this is well below the average abortion rate for countries with liberal abortion laws, but also well below the abortion rate for countries with highly restrictive laws, such as Argentina. But I think the question is as interesting as the answer. Because the question, do abortion rates increase after decriminalization, reflects a lot about how one thinks of abortion. And more importantly, how one thinks about the women who seek abortion and the reasons they seek abortion. There's a fascinating legal study which looks at why women terminate abortion, the reasons they give, and it looks at it both before and after decriminalization in Canada. And remarkably, the reasons that women give as to why they terminate pregnancy don't differ that much with or without the criminal law. Women continue to voice their need for abortion services in and with respect to their health and well-being. Now, over time, as new norms developed around access to abortion, and especially as people started to access abortion as a component of primary care, we learned new things about why people seek to terminate their pregnancy, the circumstances of their lives that affect their decisions about sexuality and reproduction, and the consequences, more importantly, of the decisions that they make. Most critically, I think, is the fact that once abortion becomes part of social and health policy, we can also act to intervene on those reasons why people seek terminations in ways that you just cannot under a criminal regime. So abortion rates reduced in Canada primarily because we had increased access to very good contraceptive methods, as well as increased provision of sexuality education. Services were provided earlier and with near perfect safety records, again, because we had better quality of care in the system, including through public health insurance for abortion. We had a diversity of providers, including nurse practitioners and nurses, now being involved in abortion care. Again, this increased the availability of care, allowing people to terminate pregnancies earlier, but also to have available to them many other options. This included a number of social policy measures around education, housing, labor, safety, prevention of violence. All of these measures inform the conditions under which people make decisions about their reproduction. Decisions about whether to have and under what terms to raise their children. In other words, when you move from a criminal to a health system, you can start to design the system to meet people's needs, which is again made possible only by building care environments that recognize women as full and equal members of society, that they are respected in society, that laws are responsible to the conditions of their lives, and for which abortion is only one part of those lives. But it's a part that's connected to so many other aspects of their personal, social, and economic well-being. And so the second question often asked of Canada is, well, have you achieved this goal? This full integration of abortion into health and social policy? What have been the challenges of achieving this goal? Well, one struggle that we had is the fact that Canada, like Argentina, is a federal state. And so immediately after decriminalization, every province was left to pursue its own course with respect to abortion. And we saw a great difference in the policies adopted, which created a whole new set of inequalities in access. And we struggled with those inequalities for over 30 years. But over time, eventually, the provinces converged around a common set of policy standards for universal, accessible, and comprehensive care. But this took far too long and involved such unnecessary cost and conflict. It required litigation and interventions by the courts and political actors over and over again. Now, with Parliament in Canada having been so focused on recrafting a criminal law, I think we lost an opportunity to really work creatively towards a federal framework for universal, accessible, and comprehensive care. This didn't demand a uniformity in approach across the provinces, but some set, I think, of guiding principles for this collective goal. You have this opportunity in Argentina today to not only decriminalize abortion, but also to set a framework for its responsible regulation into the future. And I really hope that you find success in this opportunity created for the construction of this new, powerful law rooted in democratic principles of health and human rights, because it can really be a model, I think, for Canada and much of the rest of the world in thinking forward of what abortion rights can mean as a positive social and economic policy. So thanks very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Gracias por tu intervención. Como ella expresó y quedó claro, el sistema canadiense no es un sistema igual al nuestro y que se puede traspolar y aplicar exactamente, básicamente porque ellos no tienen una ley que criminalizó el aborto, sino que fue una decisión de la Corte. Sin embargo, entendemos que hay durante todos estos 30 años lecciones que Canadá aprendió que pueden ser muy interesantes para traer a este proceso de debate que está teniendo delante en nuestro país. Y en Amnistía Internacional tomamos la decisión de traer a Joanna justamente para tener conversaciones con distintos actores políticos para derribar algunos mitos que hay, que existen y que están dando vuelta alrededor de este debate, como por ejemplo que si se penaliza el aborto todas las mujeres van a salir corriendo a abortar, entre otros, y esa es la idea, un poco la trajimos para poder conversar con distintos actores políticos y poder conversar sobre algunas dudas. Y una de las preguntas que a nosotras nos sugiera que tenemos como varias preguntas que estuvimos pensando en estos días respecto al modelo canadiense. Una de ellas era, obviamente se llega a la Corte porque hay durante muchos años muchos litigios. Es un sistema que tiene, que es una decisión de la Corte que realmente logra una muy buena implementación a nivel local, a nivel local y a nivel más provincial, por traducirlo de alguna manera. Y una de nuestras preguntas estos días era, ¿cuál fue el incentivo del Poder Ejecutivo, o el rol que el Poder Ejecutivo tuvo en relación a este fallo de la Corte, ¿no? ¿Qué es lo que el Poder Ejecutivo hizo? ¿Cuál fue el incentivo que tuvo el Poder Ejecutivo para acercarse a la Corte y plantear lo que planteó, básicamente? Esa es una de las preguntas.
So the role of government in the court case was quite interesting, both before and then after the judgment came down. The judgment, as I mentioned, was based on procedural fairness. They didn't enter the question of whether or not there should be a law on abortion. They looked rather at the law on abortion, and they asked, how is it working, in effect, on the ground? How do people access care? And what was amazing about this judgment is that they had a report that was created by a federal commission. The federal government had tasked a committee in the mid-1970s to take a look at the operation of the law. And this report was very comprehensive. They went to the data, Statistics Canada, they interviewed members of the Ministry of Health, they went to the different hospitals and talked to providers. They really looked at, again, the operation of the law, not whether or not there should or should not be a law or the policy underlying it. And as a consequence of this report, they were able then to reason that whatever justification there was behind the law, which was a dual justification, both in the interest of protecting prenatal life, but also in the interest of protecting the health of women, that the law was not serving either goals. In practice, how it worked. It was working so dysfunctionally that indeed it wasn't avoiding any abortions, because why? It was simply pushing people outside the system into the clandestine network. And second, it actually wasn't protecting the health or life of women as it was intended to do, because it was causing such delays in access to care. It was having so many procedural boundaries that many hospitals never set up committees, didn't offer services. Many of the committees themselves were highly dysfunctional because there was no standard in which they applied. Women had no idea whether or not or on what grounds they would be granted or refused an abortion. So the executive served a very powerful role in just understanding or documenting how their law worked effectively. And there's been litigation globally that has asked just for this information, to ask governments to document or seek to understand how the law works in practice. Because I think that's a mark of legitimate government, which is not only to pass laws, but also to be accountable for how those laws function in practice. And the executive, that is their role. Legislatures pass law, executive administer law. And so to effectively administer a law, you need to understand how it works in practice. After the court ruling, again, as I mentioned, it really went to the provinces because the provinces have constitutional jurisdiction over health. And what was found was this gross inequality in the way in which provinces were enacting policies. Some were very liberal, some were very restrictive. You had people moving across provinces in order to access services. And so what did the federal government do, and especially the executive in that space? Well, what was interesting is by this time, the policy of the federal government had changed. They didn't have, as I mentioned, any legal federal framework on abortion or even reproductive health. But what they did have was a law called the Canada Health Act. The Canada Health Act is basically an agreement between the federal and provincial governments around universal, comprehensive care. It's a fiscal statute. It sets terms or criteria for provincial health insurance plans that must be met in order to receive a federal grant of money to support those social programs. And what the federal government started to do was to enforce these criteria in the realm of abortion care. So they said, for example, on comprehensive care. Comprehensive care is that you must fund and make available all medically necessary care. And so they started to look at policies that distinguish among who and where abortion services were provided. If you provided them in hospitals, they were publicly funded. If in clinics, they were not covered. And the federal government said, explain to us why you have this difference of treatment as a condition of receiving federal transfer of money. They did the same thing with respect to accessible care. Explain why you have user fees around abortion care, but not around other physician services. Now, some provinces simply said, we are committed to a conservative policy, and we will withgo your funding in order to maintain our policy. The federal government really had no means of doing any form of enforcement where the provinces were willing to withgo the federal funds. But what they did have to do is answer to their own constituencies. They had to explain to residents in the province why they were refusing support for the public health insurance scheme, which again would have a penalty. So it wouldn't be that they just didn't receive funding for abortion services, they had a penalty on the entire healthcare system. And this worked in some ways and in other ways not. Again, I think it was a limit of not having a federal framework on reproductive health, a reproductive health strategy. Not simply on abortion, but seeing abortion as part of comprehensive care.
Una de las cuestiones que se están planteando en el marco del debate, o uno de los proyectos que aparecen en provincias, incluso a nivel acá federal, es el tema de la objeción de conciencia. ¿Puedes contarnos un poco cómo se encargan?
So again, there's no law on abortion. As such, all delivery requirements related to abortion are dealt with through the general healthcare law that applies to all healthcare services. And this means that the individual colleges, regulatory colleges that regulate the practice of medicine, of nursing, nurse practitioners, they will deal with the issue of conscientious refusal. And so they've put forward a number of different policies. The Canadian Medical Association has a policy on conscientious refusal. The Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons have a policy. And interestingly, the policies are different across the country, which makes it a difficult question. And so the policies are now being litigated in the courts again. And there was just a recent decision out of the Ontario courts on the question of whether or not a policy that required what we call effective referral was unconstitutional, a violation of religious freedom. Effective referral requires a physician to have to refer to another physician or healthcare provider who they know will provide the service, so as to avoid simply continuing to refer in a circle until the time is too late, or because, in other words, gross inequalities or delays in services. But what was interesting is when the physician groups challenged this policy, they offered instead the policies of other provinces that had created different mechanisms to deal with referral. For example, they said, why do you need a physician referral for services? Why not have direct access to abortion care? Simply eliminate a physician referral requirements. And indeed, this is what a number of provinces have done, so that patients can access care directly rather than needing to go through a referral. Another way in which they have addressed it in some provinces is by creating a central network, or hotline if you like, in which patients again can access directly and receive the name and location of a willing provider. I think these are very smart recommendations, because in truth, abortion care shouldn't rely on any one provider. You should be able to design your health system in a way so as to avoid conflicts. Indeed, no one wants to receive care from someone who doesn't want to provide it. This is not an optimal setting for anyone. And so if you can design your system in a way in which you can avoid conflict rather than have to address it, this would be a responsible health policy. And indeed, this is, I think, where we're headed in Canada. And it's made easier by increasing the number and types of providers in the system. So with the introduction of medical abortion, we're having reforms to allow nurses and nurse practitioners to provide care. You'll have more providers, willing providers, into the system that, again, you won't have to rely on a single physician in a single clinic or hospital that's the only pathway to care. And that's the most responsible, again, policy measure to address conflicts of conscience.
Uno de los objetivos de esta charla era derribar los mitos alrededor del impacto de las consecuencias de despenalizar el aborto de Canadá a la luz de lo que está pasando en Argentina en el contexto actual. El aumento de los números de aborto, el uso del aborto como método anticonceptivo, los abortos en casos de embarazos avanzados. ¿Nos podés contar de la experiencia canadiense sobre estos mitos?
Again, the data is remarkable in the sense of the criminal laws not being effective in achieving the ends of the law itself. In other words, criminal laws do not stop or prevent abortions. They simply increase the risk of abortions. And this has been documented, well documented, across a number of different country contexts. And so the rate of abortion is significantly higher in more restrictive legal regimes. And so whatever your policy position on abortion, criminal laws are not the answer. If you are seeking to protect unborn life, the criminal law does not achieve this end. If you are seeking to protect women from risky, clandestine procedures, the criminal law is not an effective means. And so, what are an effective means to reduce the abortion rate, if that is your goal? If you look at countries, the countries that have been most successful in reducing the rates of abortion are those with liberal laws. And so the answer is why? It seems counterintuitive, but not if you're interested in actually assessing in an empirical way how laws work. And so why did liberal abortion laws result in a decrease in the numbers of abortion? Well, in large measure, because people want to prevent or avoid pregnancy. And there are many different ways to do this, including access to contraceptive measures. And so what we found is, when abortion is legal in the system, people can more openly talk about their intentions. Their intentions to want to avoid a pregnancy. They can talk with physicians and healthcare providers about that. They are given more options, therefore, about their intentions, including access to contraceptives. This is especially important with respect to adolescents. In Canada, the abortion rate dropped across especially 15 to 19-year-olds and 20 to 24-year-olds, but it dropped even more significantly with respect to that first group, with respect to 15 to 19-year-olds. And the question is why? Again, because they didn't have to hide the idea that they were sexually active or that they were having or in need of sexual health services. And once you could start openly talking about these issues, you could start providing comprehensive care, sexuality education, access to contraceptives, talking about violence within sexual relationships. It's the idea of providing really care that responds to the needs of people. And abortion is never an isolated healthcare service. When we criminalize abortion, we treat it that way. We make it that way in the lives of people. But for most people, it's a continuum of care. They want to prevent pregnancy. They want to terminate pregnancy where that happens. They want to carry pregnancies to term where they're able to, where they have the social and economic support to do it. And again, once you remove abortion from the criminal law, you can start addressing that kind of life cycle of people with respect to their reproductive lives. Do you know how many people access abortion services and go on to have children and families? It's a vast majority of people. And that's just the truth of it. Abortion is not this isolated moment in your life. It's instead part of your continuing life cycle as someone who is sexually active and reproduction is part of your decision-making that changes over your life course. But I can tell you that where abortion is criminalized, and where you have to undergo risky procedures, where you cannot talk to people about it, it can be the defining moment in your life. Because for many people, it costs them their life at that moment, either through injury or through death. Criminal law makes abortion the defining moment of someone's life. Versus, abortion is part of social and health policy, and this was really the understanding of why you have people accessing services much early in their pregnancies. You know the safety profile of abortion in Canada? Less than 1% of abortions have any complications. Abortion is safe. How many people die of abortion in Canada? 0. This is the simple fact. Abortion is made unsafe by criminal or restrictive laws. And so these facts, the fact of having early term abortions, most abortions in Canada happen under 12 weeks because the care is accessible. The fact of complications being almost reduced to nil is the fact of the social policy. Having nobody die from an unsafe abortion is again a function of social policy. These are all ways in which abortion deaths are not in any way required or necessary. They are entirely preventable deaths. And on some level, government must answer that. Nobody has to die from unsafe abortion. And so if you have any, I don't really care what the rate is, I need just one abortion-related death to speak to the injustice of an abortion policy. Because no one should be dying of what is otherwise a safe medical procedure.
Bueno, no me voy a partir hasta el final de la actividad, así que primero le dejo a un compañero, no es que tenemos allá, pero Acompañaron derecho al aborto legal, seguro y gratuito. Tengo un montón de preguntas, voy a tratar de hacer una sola. Que yo leo mucho de tus trabajos sobre reducción de daños, labores de reducción de daños en América Latina, soy investigadora y militante en este tema. Entonces tengo una pregunta que es un poco compleja, pero me dirás si puedes responder. Usted empezó hablando sobre cuáles son las creencias en abortos y la legislación, digamos, es el principio y después hay muchos pasos más. Y sabemos por muchos países donde el aborto se legalizó, por ejemplo, Francia, que yo conozco de cerca, hay un abordaje muy centrado en lo biomédico. Según lo que usted dijo, en Canadá hay un abordaje integral, no centrado en la medicina, despenalizado. Entonces le quería preguntar, por un lado, si conoce investigaciones sobre experiencias de aborto por fuera del sistema de salud, o si hay grupos feministas que acompañan abortos por fuera del sistema de salud, si hay datos sobre eso, o incluso del segundo trimestre, o en casos que ocurre el sistema. Y por otro lado, si cree que la legislación canadiense, al ser, si no me equivoco, una de las más amplias del mundo, de alguna manera neutraliza la carga de estigma, de culpa, de estigmatización social que sigue pesando en muchos países donde el aborto es legal.
I think it's an excellent question around the social dimensions of abortion. And a good measure is, how is abortion talked about in the media in Canada or in private conversations among people? Is it still a secret, even though it's legal? Are people still ashamed of it? And remarkably, this was one of the effects of the criminal law that I would say only in the last 10 or 15 years have people started to talk about, which is that they had to keep this moment in their lives secret from the people they most cared about. You know, sisters in families who were not there to support each other, partners who were able to share it with their family members or explain it, and even in cases in which it was a medically indicated termination, you know, part of the kind of trauma of how they were treated in the health system, especially under a criminal regime, that it was still something considered illicit or wrong, or they had to go and receive approval from a committee. All of those indignities of the system are what really tried to change, I think, when you move it into health and social policy. It's a normalizing of this experience. And it doesn't mean that it's not still morally significant for people. You know, just because you don't have a law that requires you to reflect on your decision, shouldn't anyone pretend that people don't seriously think about the actions that they take. And so I think moving it from the criminal realm into the health and social realm, it's not only that it provides greater material access to services, it also opens up this space for people to feel comfort and care in what are often very difficult moments for them. Difficult because, again, there are so many different reasons why people terminate a pregnancy. But again, where the law only names 2, these are the only reasons you can ever speak of. You know, when in truth we've lost the human side of abortion. These are moral decisions that are being made by people who are moral actors. They are thinking about it. They are deeply contemplative of the life for themselves and their families. And the fact that we've lost that moral discourse in a criminal setting, I think is something that should be seen as a harm. I think it's continuing to be opened up, especially in Canada, as abortion moves from single isolated clinics into primary care. The idea that it is something that every doctor who has a patient of reproductive age who could become pregnant, they talk about this as just part of their possible course of care in their lifetime. Again, the numbers of women who didn't know about the methods of abortion, had this irrational fear about safety around abortion, this was again very limiting in their lives. So the ability to talk, again with your health providers, to talk with friends about different ways in which they manage their sexuality and their fertility can only be, I think, a positive measure of decriminalization. Now, the great thing is where it can actually be incorporated into social policy as well. Linking people's reproductive decision-making to policies around housing, around security in their work lives, around education, because that's in truth the context in which people make decisions. And so if you really want to understand and support people in all of their reproductive lives, it's about seeing it as a healthcare issue, but as a social policy issue as well. I think it is equally as tragic when somebody wants to carry a pregnancy to term, wants to have a child, but because they don't have protection from violence, they don't have security in their job, they'll have to leave their education, cannot have that child or raise that child in a healthy environment. And I think, again, thinking about abortion care in a comprehensive way, we would want policy measures that go to all of those ends. It's about supporting people in their decisions. And I think people on both sides of the debate can come together in that project.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Es una pregunta capaz un poco tonta, pero ¿cómo cree que en un estado tan ligado a la Iglesia Católica
católica podría tratarse el tema del aborto acá en Argentina.
I mean, I think the first question is whether the Catholic Church represents the people of a country, because this is the legitimacy of that institution in many ways in these democratic debates, you know, where they do indeed have democratic authority, where people do hold these religious beliefs as articulated by the church. So if we start at the outset that these are legitimate interventions because there is a group of Argentinian people who believe honestly and in good faith the religious understandings of the beginnings of life and so forth. I would say at that moment that it is the job of lawmakers to craft a law that is respectful of the diversity of interests in any political setting. And so this means that if prenatal life is a legitimate state interest, it's held by others, that this has to be part of the law that is crafted. Now, that is not the only interest. And as well, I think that you have to create a law that is effective to that end. And so if criminal laws do not in any way achieve this end of the protection of prenatal life, because indeed they result in an increase in the numbers of abortion, people need to address that. They need to come to terms with that. You cannot be arguing for a criminal law that defeats your own goals, because otherwise we can be legitimately suspect that those are your goals. What criminal laws do achieve is that they harm and punish women. And so we can ask, is that your goal? Because if you are in favor of criminal law, knowing that these are the ends of the criminal law, suffering, harm, and death, you have to ask whether or not you want to achieve those ends. These are the effects of the law that you are supporting. I think there is a lot of middle ground in the sense of achieving an abortion law that is highly respectful of the human rights of women, of women's lives and health, and of their democratic citizenship in this country. We know that those are liberal laws that respect all of those values, and we also know that liberal laws result in a decreasing rate of abortion. We also know that liberal laws do not in any way contradict also having laws that support people who want to have families and raise children. And so in the interests of people on both sides, there should be able in a democratic country to craft a law that meets those interests. This polarization is a false polarization. And I think, and I'm supportive, if you take the government at its word that it is trying to develop a pragmatic, responsible law that will be able to meet the human rights obligations of the government with respect to women, while at the same time preserving whatever interests people have in some value in prenatal life. Indeed, if you speak to many women who terminate their pregnancies, they can hold these two ideas together. If you just speak to women rather than speaking for women, you will find solutions to these problems. Because it is not that women are immoral actors. They have ways of reconciling these different values. They often act on behalf of their families when they make decisions. And so this is the language we hear in many different settings of trusting women. It's not just trusting them to make decisions for themselves, it's also trusting them to find a future policy positions, a democratic initiative to be able to achieve the goals of health and human rights, which are shared goals. And so I think it's an impossible situation when you polarize in this way, there is a large middle ground, which is a democratic solution to this question of abortion, in which so many people can find a space for themselves that does not require this suffering, death, and disability as a result of criminal laws. Argentinian Congress has an amazing moment to craft that law through the middle road. And I think holding these hearings and hearing from people their views will help them to do that work.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Yo quisiera hacerte una pregunta. Mencionaste antes el informe del Poder Ejecutivo y la posibilidad de haber contado con un diagnóstico de situación respecto a cómo no estaba funcionando el sistema de indicaciones y la criminalización, básicamente el sistema del aborto. Me pregunto cómo fue evolucionando. Nosotros hoy incluso creo que si quisiéramos tener un diagnóstico, y creo que un poco la sociedad civil cumple algunos baches a la hora de intentar entender cuál es el sufrimiento de las mujeres y cuáles son las barreras, pues lo hacemos de nuevo de manera muy emparchada, pero no existe una política de Estado, de un sistema de información que haya una conducta de las provincias de reportar, ni siquiera los abortos legales, porque es verdad que es difícil crear o llegar a un número cierto respecto de los abortos que se hacen en el mercado clandestino. Pero me pregunto cómo es en Canadá, si hay una política de salud, de instar a las provincias a que reporten, si quizás incluso con los desafíos que mencionaste que hubieron al inicio, en que las provincias fueron también un poco resistentes a la hora de garantizar acceso a aborto, bueno, si hay igual una cultura de producir información, de sistematizar información para seguir contando con un diagnóstico que te permita seguir trabajando con política pública al respecto.
I think this is an absolute minimum obligation of a government, which is to know the effects of their laws. Because in part, the only way that a democratic government can legitimately uphold a criminal law on abortion is by turning its eyes to what is happening on the ground. Because otherwise, how could you possibly justify the harms of these laws? The only way is to pretend that you don't know they exist. And so the basic obligation to investigate, to record, and to make public the effects of abortion law, I think, is something to fight for in Congress. And an interesting part of the Canadian history is that, laws have good and bad parts. And the criminal law on abortion in Canada, one of its good parts was that it required hospitals to report on the abortions provided within their institution. And so you had developed a therapeutic abortion survey with reportings such that this was part of the commission could get statistics quite easily on where abortions were being provided in the country, could see the inequitable distributions of those provisions. When the law was struck down and no new law came into effect, that information provision was also struck. And so there was now no obligation on institutions to report the provision of abortion. But what was interesting is that hospitals voluntarily continued to report. And then increasingly clinics also started to report. But there are gaps in the data by virtue of, again, not having any mandatory obligation. And so I think having a federal policy or law about this information gathering will be, again, a really good part, a good policy intervention of an executive actor to be able to ensure equity in access across the country. In Canada, we had one province that for 30 years did not have any abortions provided in that province. Indeed, they developed a policy to send women to another province. They would pay for those abortions. They wouldn't, of course, pay for any of the travel requirements or any of the hotel stays or the taking time off work to have to travel. But being able to have that information was critical, again, for the federal interventions to ensure a system of equitable care. So I think this idea of information is a critical part of a good federal reproductive health policy. We know that in many ways abortion is not like other healthcare services, especially because of the social stigma around it. And so sometimes you need positive interventions to provide simply equality in access to care. Information would be one. Another measure that some provinces have introduced is a law that protects the identity of providers. So if someone makes access to information request, the government is allowed to withhold the locations or identities of providers for their security. Another measure that's introduced in some provinces is what's called bubble zone laws. It basically creates a zone around clinics or physician offices where protesters are not allowed to enter, or sets restrictions on the kinds of activities, such that, of course, protection of your expression, but no right to harass another person. And so these kinds of laws, again, they're all framed in the sense of guaranteeing equality in access to healthcare. The governments justify it on the same principles that inform all healthcare delivery: comprehensive, accessible, and universal care. In the abortion context, that might require different kinds of policy measures, but the idea is that the principles in which you legislate on abortion are the same across Canada. That it's treated like a healthcare service, like any other, informed consent, mature minor doctrine, addressing provider gaps. Maybe in the case of abortion, that's more likely due to conscientious refusal than in the cases of cardiac care or any other kind of care. But the idea is that the goal is the same. The goal is to ensure equality in access to care, once abortion is put into the health and social policy realm.
¿Tenemos alguna pregunta más?
Me parece que estos tres de los puntos que señalaste son bien interesantes. El tema de la información, de la obligación del Estado de proveer información en términos de cantidad de abortos y procedimientos realizados. Me parece que el tema de proteger a los médicos en un sentido y el tema del pago, como digamos, el pago zones. Por este proyecto de ley que se está discutiendo en Argentina, obviamente hay muchos más proyectos de ley, y es muy probable que el proyecto que salga contenga alguna incorporación de algunos de los otros proyectos. ¿Vos sugerirías, aún sin tener un país que tiene una ley, sino que en realidad tiene sobre todo una práctica, pero vos sugerirías un país que tiene aborto legal en ciertos casos, cuya implementación es casi inexistente, por decirlo de algún modo, es realmente casi inexistente? ¿Vos sugerirías que un proyecto de ley incluya estas tres cuestiones?
So I think there's a trick in legislating any kind of healthcare, which is the question of a law that is not restrictive or limiting of good healthcare practice. And we know that practice evolves over time. There's different clinical competencies, there's new innovations in healthcare, and so you wouldn't want to set a law that is too restrictive in that way. I think an abortion law makes the most sense where it sets out a kind of framework or guiding principles. The draft or model law is effective in really communicating the values that lie behind the abortion law. And these are values of health, of dignity, of freedom, of equality, of life, and being able to create provisions that can best allow you to achieve those aims. And so, for example, the information provisions, those allow you to ensure that whatever law or policy is implemented in a specific province is achieving or is guided by those same values. Health, dignity, equality, right? It's setting up a kind of measure of assessment. The same thing I think is true with respect to, for example, conscientious refusal, is being able to state a kind of guiding framework for that, which is again, that it's an obligation of the health system to arrange the provision in ways that ensure accessibility to care, which is, most honestly, in an efficient way, avoiding conflicts between providers and patients. And so being able to set up a law that really guides provincial implementation, both in terms of setting framework for doing it, but also setting the values which should inform an abortion law. That would be, I think, the most successful, really, abortion law and policy. And it would, in some ways, avoid a 30-year struggle, which we have experienced in Canada. Because the truth is, in this vacuum of a law, certain norms have developed. I mean, statute is not the only way that people regulate their behaviors, especially in the medical context. Medical norms, protocols, policies probably affect the behaviors of providers much more than legislative actions. And so the idea is to, in some ways, construct a policy framework that set the values for whatever those instruments will be coming into the future. We didn't have that. Instead, people had to go to court and litigate this over and over again. It was the courts that set that value structure. And they could do it in a common law country only over 30 years of evolution. I don't actually think that's the right way to do it. I think you can set it out as a principled law at the outset to guide, again, legislative and policy action. I wouldn't want to hamstring the different provinces. In our context, there were some provinces that developed very innovative regulatory systems. And I think you want to allow that in a place like Argentina as well. And other contexts in which they have to be more conservative. So you want that flexibility in a federal state. That's a good thing. But being able to have this document that really gives a pathway for the resolution of these very tense measures. And what is really helpful in the proposed law that I saw was the references that are made to existing legal measures, such as on the capacity of minors to consent, or on the rights of patients. In many ways, an abortion law shouldn't reinvent all of these established measures. There are many protective measures that already exist in healthcare laws. And a federal law that can make reference to that can give people guidance, that indeed it is not about 8 or 10-year-olds consenting to abortion care and accessing it without any parental involvement, because that is not true of 10-year-olds with respect to any form of healthcare. And so seeing these norms of evolving capacity, norms of maturity, the health system already has many of these protective measures. Again, it's this false claim of decriminalization being now a setting of a completely deregulated space. That was not true in Canada, and it's not true in any national context. Abortion gets picked up, folded into an existing healthcare system. And a federal law that can give notice of that and can assist in that, I think is a very positive measure.
Bueno, gracias, Joanna, fue un placer tener una hora hablándonos y y gracias a todas y todos que vinieron a escucharlo.